The sun burns, the wind bites, and the horizon stretches forever. Yet the cowboys rode on. Days without rivers, nights without rain. Still, they found water where none should exist. Was it luck? Or something far older? Here's how wild West cowboys found water when there was none. The desert was merciless. Heat shimmered in waves, the horizon stretched empty, and the horses panted with tongues dry as dust. Out there, water was no luxury. It meant survival within hours. When every drop meant life, cowboys turned to the wild itself for guidance. They followed animal tracks. Every creature on the frontier needed water. Buffalo, deer, coyotes, even quail. Cowboys learned early that animals knew the land better than any map. In the early morning, before the sun scorched away the signs, they read the ground like scripture. Hoofprints pressed deep, claw marks cutting through sand, trails converging like veins toward a hidden source. Herd tracks meant something big, maybe a watering hole that still held life after weeks of heat. Bird prints and small mammal trails pointed to puddles trapped in rock crevices or shaded gullies. When the path grew faint, cowboys dismounted, crouching low to feel the dust between their fingers, testing its moisture. Sometimes they'd find the faintest line of cracked mud, proof that water had once flowed there. And where it once flowed, it often still lingered, buried beneath a thin crust of earth. The trick wasn't just in following the tracks. It was in knowing which ones lied. Predators circled, prey doubled back, and sometimes a path ended in mirage. But with patience and instinct, cowboys learned to read the truth, to see which way the tracks widened, where the hooves sank deepest, where the earth still held the ghost of a puddle. It was a kind of desert literacy, passed from scouts and natives to the drifters and riders who came after. The Comanche, Apache, and Navajo had taught it long before the word cowboy existed. To them, water wasn't something you searched for. It was something you listened to through the land itself. And when a cowboy finally found it, a shallow pool beneath scrub brush, a muddy hollow glistening faintly in the shade, it wasn't just relief. It was triumph. The animals had led him there, and the desert had spared him once more. He'd let his horse drink first, watching the ripples spread across the still surface. Then he'd cup his hands, taste the grit, and feel life return. Yet the wise knew the tracks could only lead you so far. The real secret often came from above in the silent wings that painted the sky at dawn and dusk. The desert had its own language, and the sky was one of its most honest voices. When the earth offered no clue, cowboys lifted their eyes. They watched the birds. In the first light of dawn, before the heat rose, flocks began to stir. Small birds lifted from thorny shrubs, flying low and fast toward unseen destinations. To a thirsty cowboy, that direction was a promise. Birds never flew without purpose. They rose from roosts and drifted straight toward water. The same pattern unfolded again at dusk as the day's heat faded and wings beat softly against the amber light. Old riders said the birds knew where life still whispered. Doves and quail were the surest sign. They never strayed far from creeks or springs, and their paths often pointed the way to the last puddles left after summer storms. Waterfowl meant something bigger, maybe a pond or a hidden bend in a river. Even the flight of ravens told stories, circling high where moisture gathered in cool canyons. Cowboys would stop and study the horizon, shielding their eyes with a dusty hand, watching the angle of each flight. They knew the difference between birds hunting for food and birds returning to drink. It was instinct sharpened by survival, passed down from scouts and tribal guides who had learned the desert's rhythm long before the cattle drives began. Sometimes the only clue was a faint line of movement, a shimmer of wings heading west just as the sun began to fall. A cowboy would mount up, following the pattern through the heat haze, trusting that nature never lied about water. Hours later, if he was lucky, he'd find it. A shallow basin tucked beneath a rocky ledge, cool enough to reflect the fading sky. Finding water through birds wasn't just a trick, it was partnership. The riders and the sky shared a silent understanding. Where life gathered, it left signs for those who knew how to see them. As the stars emerged and the fire cracked in the night wind, a cowboy might look up again, watching silhouettes glide home. In their quiet flight, he found hope. The same hope that kept every living thing moving through the endless dry. But not all water hid in the air or under tracks. Some of it whispered through the trees, green against the brown, where life refused to die. The desert could lie. It could paint mirages, twist the light, and hide what little life remained. But one truth never changed. Where green survived, water was never far behind. Cowboys learned to search for the color of hope. They searched for green. When the world turned to dust and bone, a single streak of green on the horizon was a beacon. Cottonwoods were the most trusted sign. Their pale, fluttering leaves shimmered even in the hottest wind, catching sunlight like silver coins. No tree grew taller or brighter unless its roots had found what men could not, a hidden stream or buried vein of moisture. A cowboy riding through miles of red sand and brittle sagebrush would scan the distance for that flicker of green. It might start as a faint shadow, barely rising above the heat waves, but as he rode closer, the colors deepened, the leaves thickened, and the air began to change. The smells shifted first, dry dust giving way to damp earth and the faint scent of life. Cottonwoods weren't alone in their secrets. Willows, reeds, and wild grapevines all betrayed the presence of water. Even the small plants spoke. Grass grew taller, the soil darkened, and insects buzzed low in the air. To trained eyes, every blade, every color, every scent told a story. The cowboys had learned from those who came before, the native tribes who had read the desert for centuries. The Apache could spot a cottonwood grove from miles away and know it meant shade, drink, and rest. The Comanche knew to follow the tree line until the ground grew soft. Cowboys absorbed that wisdom, pairing it with their own instinct until they could ride through the barren lands and read them like an open book. When they reached the trees, they didn't rush. They moved slow, scanning for animal prints, listening for the buzz of flies or the trickle of hidden water beneath roots. Sometimes the stream ran just below the surface. Sometimes the trees grew over a spring that bubbled up only after rain. Finding green was finding life. Beneath those cottonwoods, a man could rest, refill his canteen, and breathe air that no longer stung his lungs. Yet not all water showed its colors above ground. Some hid deeper, in silence, waiting for those brave enough to dig through the dry earth to find it. The cowboys knew the land never truly forgot water. Even when rivers vanished and arroyos lay cracked beneath the sun, they carried memory in their depths. A dry creek bed could look lifeless, but to a desperate rider, it was a promise waiting beneath the dust. Long before they carried shovels, they learned to read the signs. The shape of the land told its story. A winding depression through the desert floor, smooth stones half buried in sand, the faint shimmer of silt instead of coarse gravel. These were hints that water had once flowed there, and if it had flowed once, it might still linger. Cowboys would kneel, touch the sand, and feel for coolness just below the surface. In the heat of midday, the ground might still breathe a faint chill, the whisper of trapped moisture. That was where they would dig. With tin cups, knives, or even bare hands, they clawed through layers of sand until the grains turned darker. Sometimes it was only a few inches deep. Sometimes they had to dig for an hour before the soil began to glisten. And then, slowly, the miracle happened. A thin trickle seeping up from the ground, darkening the sand into mud. They'd wait, patient and silent, as the hollow filled drop by drop. A horse would smell it first, snorting and pawing at the edge of the hole. Then, when the water cleared, both rider and beast would drink, grateful for the earth's quiet mercy. Not every bed held success. Some were too old, too dry, or buried under years of drought. But for those who knew where to look, beneath shaded bends, under clusters of reeds, or near the outer curve of an arroyo, the desert often rewarded persistence. These lessons came from those who lived closest to the land. The Apache and the Navajo taught cowboys to dig not with strength, but with observation. They said the desert would reveal its secrets if you learned to listen before you worked. To dig in a dry creek bed was to trust the memory of water. The ground itself held the story, and those who listened lived to tell it. Yet the desert had more subtle clues still. Sometimes the ground gave no sound, only a touch, a coolness beneath the fingers that told a man he was close. When the sun scorched everything in sight, when even the air seemed to shimmer with thirst, cowboys turned to the ground itself. The desert could hide water from the eyes, but not from the touch. The soil remembered. A seasoned rider would dismount, kneel, and press his palm flat against the earth. The first touch told him everything. If the sand burned, the land was dry and hopeless. But if it held even the faintest chill, there was life buried underneath. That subtle coolness meant trapped moisture, a shallow vein that could be coaxed back into the open. They learned to test the ground in the right places. Shaded hollows, the base of cliffs, the underside of a wind-carved ledge. Sometimes they'd scrape away the top layer of dust and feel the change instantly, the grit turning heavier, darker, and colder against their fingers. That was enough to know water waited below. The soil's temperature told its story like breath on the skin. A cool patch beneath the sun meant there was seepage or a spring somewhere nearby. Cowboys followed that instinct, moving slowly, checking the ground every few feet until they could pinpoint the softest place to dig. This wasn't a trick taught in books, but through generations of watching and feeling. Native guides had shown early trail riders how to listen with their hands, to treat the earth not as an obstacle, but as an old friend whispering clues. Sometimes the reward was a thin trickle, just enough to fill a hat or let a horse drink. Sometimes it was nothing but damp sand, a tease from the desert. Still, cowboys trusted the signs. Even a hint of moisture could lead to something greater, a seep hidden under stone, or a spring sleeping just out of sight. It was patience that saved lives in the wild. Those who rushed missed the quiet signals. Those who waited found what others walked past. But when the ground offered no answer at all, the cowboys looked upward instead, to the ridges and mesas where the land itself traced the paths of forgotten rivers. Imagine standing alone under the blazing sky, every inch of land below stretching into nothing but dust and silence. No streams, no ponds, not even a trickle of hope. What would you do? Keep walking, pray for rain. Cowboys didn't. They climbed. When the desert refused to speak, they rose above it. From the top of a hill or mesa, the land finally made sense. Cowboys scanned the horizon like hawks, searching for what others missed. Faint scars on the earth, twisting lines of darker soil, or narrow bands of green that betrayed a river's ghost. Have you ever looked down from a high place and seen how the world connects? How even chaos forms patterns? That's what they saw. From above, a dried riverbed revealed its story. The bends and curves told where water once danced. Clusters of cottonwoods and willows hinted at places where moisture still slept beneath the surface. Even the way the wind carved the dunes could point the way to an old watercourse. The climb wasn't easy. The sun burned their necks, rocks tore their boots, and the heat shimmered up from below. But the view was worth every step. Up high, cowboys could map their chances. They could trace where the land funneled rain, where gullies deepened into arroyos, where color shifted from pale dust to rich clay. It wasn't just strategy, it was connection. Man against nature, yet guided by it. From those heights, cowboys didn't just see survival. They saw the pulse of the desert, the veins where life once flowed and might still. Some of them said you could feel it too. A tug in the gut, an instinct pulling you towards where the land curved and the wind grew cooler. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was experience. Would you have trusted your eyes to find that line of life? Could you have seen hope where everything looked dead? The cowboys did, and that's why they lived. Because when the land below gave no answer, the sky always showed the way. And sometimes, what they saw from above led them straight to places where stone itself held the world's last drops of water. Picture the sun beating down so hard that even the air trembles. The ground is cracked, the canteens are empty, and the horses move slower with every mile. What would you do if you hadn't seen water for 2 days? Would you keep riding or stop and search the stones? Cowboys knew the answer. They looked to the rocks. In the Wild West, stone could save a man's life. Cowboys learned to find natural rock basins. Hollows carved by centuries of wind and rain. These small depressions collected precious rainwater long after the storms had passed. Some held only a few sips, others enough to fill a bucket or a horse trough. The secret was in knowing where to look. Have you ever noticed how water always finds the lowest place? Cowboys searched the canyon walls, the bases of cliffs, the shaded sides of boulders. There, in the cool pockets of stone, they found small pools, still, dark, sometimes hidden under leaves or dust. They called them stone tanks or tinajas, and in the desert they were treasure. Sometimes the water was green, thick with algae, but that didn't matter. A man on the edge of thirst learned not to be choosy. He'd strain it through cloth or let it settle and drink every drop. Horses drank straight from the rock itself, noses pressed against ancient basins that had saved travelers for generations. Native tribes had long known these places. They marked them with signs only the observant could read. A peculiar grouping of stones, a petroglyph pointing toward a hidden tank. Cowboys who rode with scouts or listened to the old stories learned to follow those clues. Think about it. The same pool that might save a cowboy today could be the same one a hunter drank from 100 years before him. Every droplet a survivor of storms long gone. Would you have found it out there in the silence? Would you have known to stop and search the stone? Cowboys did. And every time they leaned over a basin carved by time, they weren't just drinking water, they were drinking history. But the truly seasoned riders knew there was an even smarter way to find water, by following the trails already written across the land. Imagine riding through the desert, the sun high, your canteen nearly empty, your horse stumbling beneath you. Every breath feels like fire, every mile the same endless stretch of dust. What would you trust to guide you? Instinct, luck, or the faint lines carved into the earth by those who came before? Cowboys trusted the trails. These paths were not random. They were lifelines of the frontier, shaped by generations of people and animals searching for the same thing: water. Buffalo trails, native trade routes, stagecoach roads, and old wagon ruts each carried the memory of thirst and discovery. When all landmarks faded into heat and haze, cowboys looked down, reading the ground as if it were a living map. Have you ever followed a worn trail through the wild and felt that invisible pull forward? That whisper that someone had once walked the same way for the same reason? That is what the cowboys felt. They knew every bend and curve had meaning. Trails that sloped gently downhill led to lowlands, where rivers once ran. Roads lined with green brush or birdsong hinted that a spring waited nearby. Even the bones of an old camp told them they were close. Sometimes following a trail was not a choice. It was survival. A lone rider could wander for days without finding a drop of water, but the trails stitched the desert together like veins, connecting hidden basins, creeks, and shallow wells. Those paths were maps written into the land itself. Cowboys trusted what others had left behind. They stacked stones, carved initials, or cut notches into trees to say one thing clearly: this way leads to life. Each new traveler added to that silent chain of guidance and gratitude. Would you have seen those signs or ridden past them, too focused on the horizon to notice? In the desert, the difference between awareness and blindness could decide who lived to see another sunrise. Following the trails taught one truth above all: no one conquered the West alone. Every hoofprint and weathered groove in the soil proved that survival was never a solitary act. Yet even the surest trail sometimes failed. That was when a cowboy had to dig for life itself, carving hope straight from the sand. The desert gave nothing easily. When the creeks were dry and the canyon silent, cowboys turned to the ground beneath their feet. They knew that even in the harshest country, water always sought the low places. Where it gathered, a man could find it if he had the patience to dig. Flat valleys, dry meadows, and sunken basins were more than empty land. They were clues. Cowboys searched for places where the soil felt softer underfoot or where the grass grew a little thicker. Sometimes a ring of darker earth or a patch of stubborn green told them what they needed to know. Have you ever seen how life clings to the faintest sign of moisture? That was their compass. Once they chose a spot, they dug. Some used shovels, others their hands, scooping through sand and clay until the heat faded from the soil and the air turned cooler. Inch by inch, the ground changed. The grains darkened, the texture grew heavy, and finally, a shimmer appeared, a thin line of wetness that meant salvation. Water didn't always rush to the surface. Often it seeped up slowly, enough to dampen the hole. Cowboys would wait, letting the shallow pit fill drop by drop, patient as the desert demanded. They'd line the sides with stone to keep it from collapsing and cover it with brush when they moved on, leaving it for whoever came next. This wasn't guesswork. It was a skill born from watching the land. The Apache and Navajo had done it long before the cowboys rode through, teaching that the desert always remembers where water hides. The trick was learning how to ask without forcing it. Imagine that moment. The first cool mud under your fingers after hours of dry digging, the horse lowering its head to drink, the taste of life itself returning to your tongue. Out there, that small pool meant survival, and survival meant another sunrise. But even shallow wells had their limits. In some places, the desert held its secrets deeper, waiting for the careful eye that could read the soft signs of moss, reeds, and tiny springs hidden beneath stone and shadow. There were times when the desert seemed to breathe. Beneath the silence, beneath the dust and heat, it hid small miracles, springs that whispered instead of roared. Cowboys learned to listen for those whispers, to look for the living signs that the land still held water. Even in the driest country, life betrayed its secret. A patch of moss clinging to rock, a cluster of reeds swaying in a hollow, or the faint shimmer of damp soil at dawn. Have you ever noticed how nature never hides her treasures completely? Cowboys understood that if something green could grow, it was feeding from something unseen. They rode slowly through canyons, eyes scanning the edges where shade lingered longest. Moss meant moisture, always. It needed constant dampness to survive, so if a cowboy found it on a stone wall or under a ledge, he knew a spring might be seeping nearby. Reeds told the same story, their hollow stems reaching up from the earth where groundwater lay close enough to touch. Sometimes the clues were delicate. A cluster of insects hovering low, the sound of frogs even when no water was in sight, the coolness of the air beneath certain cliffs. These signs spoke softly, but to men who had learned to pay attention, they were louder than any river. A cowboy would dismount, press his hand against the moss, and feel it cool and alive beneath his fingers. He might follow it up a rocky slope until the first glint of trickling water appeared between stones. A shallow pool, clear and still, waiting quietly in the shade. They never took more than they needed. The desert taught respect. A spring could dry overnight if carelessly drained, so cowboys and their horses drank, filled their canteens, and covered the source again to keep it from the wind. Those tiny signs, the green of moss, the whisper of reeds, the taste of cold water on a burning tongue, reminded them that the land was never truly empty. It simply required faith and patience to read its language. Out there, survival belonged to the ones who could see what others missed, who trusted the smallest signs to lead them home. Water kept the cowboys alive. Food kept them moving. The same grit that taught them to find springs and hidden wells taught them to outsmart time itself. How did they turn simple trail rations into food that never spoiled? Find out in this next video right here.